The dust of 1,000 miles had settled into the lines of Cassian Ridge's face. A second skin caked by sun and sweat. He rode into Dry Hollow not with a swagger, but with the quiet weariness of a man who had seen the backside of too many longhorns to count. His horse, a sturdy roan named Boulder, moved with the same bone-deep exhaustion, its head low, its breath a soft huff in the oppressive heat. The cattle drive was done. The herd was delivered. The pay was in a leather pouch tucked deep in his saddlebag, and all that was left was the long, solitary ride home. Dry Hollow wasn't much of a town. It was more a suggestion of one, a collection of sun-bleached clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of an unforgiving landscape. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith whose hammer was currently silent, and a handful of houses that looked as tired as the people inside them. The air was still and thick, smelling of dust, manure, and the faint, bitter scent of creosote bush. For Cassian, it was just a place to water his horse and maybe wash the trail from his own throat before pushing on. He had no love for towns. They were loud, crowded places where a man's silence was often mistaken for weakness or stupidity. He bypassed the saloon, the thought of whiskey and stale cigar smoke unappealing. What he craved was the simple clarity of water and a moment of shade that didn't demand conversation. His eyes fell on a large, dilapidated barn at the edge of the settlement, its roof sagging like the spine of an old swayback horse. One of its great doors hung crooked on a single hinge, a dark, gaping mouth promising refuge from the relentless glare of the afternoon sun. It was abandoned, forgotten, a perfect place for a man and his horse to find a moment's peace. He swung down from the saddle, his joints protesting with a dull ache. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rasp, unused for hours. He led Boulder toward the yawning darkness of the barn, his boots scuffing a soft protest from the powdery earth. The air inside was a decade cooler, thick with the ghosts of old hay and dry rot, shafts of golden light, alive with dancing dust motes, pierced the gloom through gaps in the warped plank walls, striping the dirt floor like a tiger's hide. He led Boulder to a crumbling trough in the corner, unstrapped his canteen, and poured a generous amount of the precious liquid into the dusty basin. The horse drank gratefully, long, noisy gulps that echoed in the cavernous quiet. Cassian leaned against a support beam, tipping his hat back on his head and wiping a sleeve across his brow. He closed his eyes, letting the silence settle over him, a welcome blanket after weeks of bawling cattle and the ceaseless chatter of other men. It was a sound that broke the stillness, a faint rustle from the hayloft above, followed by a sharp, tiny intake of breath. Cassian didn't flinch. His body went still, every muscle coiled, but his posture remained relaxed. His eyes opened slowly, scanning the shadowed upper level. He was a man who had survived by noticing the things that didn't belong, a snake in the grass, a nervous twitch in a card player's eye, a sound where there should be none. He saw nothing but stacked bales of ancient, decaying hay. Yet, the sound had been real. It was the sound of fear. His hand didn't move toward the Colt holstered at his hip. That was an invitation, a challenge. Instead, he reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap with a deliberate slowness, and took a long drink. Every movement was measured, broadcasting a lack of aggression. He was just a thirsty traveler, nothing more. He lowered the canteen and spoke to the shadows, his voice calm and even, not much louder than a whisper. Horse was thirsty. The silence that answered him was heavier than before. It was a living thing, fraught with tension. Then, he saw it, a flicker of movement in the deepest corner of the loft, a shift in the pattern of light and dark, a person hiding. His gaze remained fixed on the spot. He knew better than to climb up there. A cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. He waited. The sun crawled across the sky, and the bars of light on the floor shifted with it. Boulder finished his water and nudged Cassian's shoulder, looking for more. Cassian gave the horse's neck a reassuring pat. He wasn't going anywhere. Patience was a virtue he had learned from the land itself. You couldn't hurry a sunrise, and you couldn't force a scared creature from its hiding place. Finally, a figure emerged from the shadows, descending the rickety ladder with a painful slowness, as if every step was a negotiation with her body. It was a girl. No, a young woman. Though the harshness of her circumstance had etched years onto her face she hadn't yet lived. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her dress, a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder and hem, smeared with dirt and what looked like axle grease. Her hair was a tangled mess of chestnut brown, escaping from a loose braid. There was a dark, fading bruise high on her cheekbone and a split in her lower lip that had just begun to heal. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a startling shade of green, wide and haunted, yet burning with a defiant flame that refused to be extinguished. And in her hands, held with a grip so tight her knuckles were white, was a Colt peacemaker. It was pointed at the floor. Not at him, but its presence filled the space between them. She reached the barn floor and took a shaky step toward him, stopping a good 20 feet away. She was exhausted. He could see that. There was a tremor in her hands she was trying to control, a hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights. She looked like a lone coyote pup, cut off from the pack, ready to fight the wolf she knew was coming. Cassian remained perfectly still, his hands kept deliberately away from his sidearm. He watched her, saw the way her chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. He could see the hammer on her revolver was down on an empty chamber. The gun was either unloaded or had already been fired. It was a bluff, a desperate, final stand. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked whisper, filled with more gravel than a creek bed. "If you're one of his men, then just shoot." The words hung in the dusty air. They were not a plea, they were a command. An exhaustion so profound that death seemed a kinder alternative to whatever she was running from. One of his men. The words told a story of possession, of a pursuer who believed he had a right to her. Cassian's gaze didn't waver from hers. He saw the story in the bruise, the torn dress, the empty gun. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of horses that had been broken with a cruel hand. Their spirits shattered but for one last ember of defiance. A man could do one of two things with a creature like that: break it completely, or offer it a gentle hand and hope it remembered kindness. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He didn't know who he was, and he didn't care. What he saw in front of him was not a problem to be solved or a danger to be neutralized. It was a human being at the very end of her rope. Without a word, he lifted his canteen again. The gesture was unhurried. He took 2 steps forward, his boots whispering in the dust, and stopped. He crouched down, placing the metal canteen on the dirt floor between them. Then, he straightened up and retreated to his original position by the support beam, giving her back the space she needed. He had made his offer. It was only water, but out here, water was life. It was a gesture that said, "I am not your enemy." The girl, Lena Ray, though he wouldn't know her name for some time, stared at the canteen as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Her eyes darted from the canteen to his face, searching for a trick, a trap. She saw none. His expression was placid, his posture non-threatening. He was simply waiting. The silence stretched on, long and vast as the desert sky. It was broken only by the soft stamp of Boulder's hoof, the creak of old timber settling in the heat, and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. Inside that silence, a silent conversation took place. He watched her fight a war within herself, the instinct to run versus the crushing need for help, the ingrained terror of men versus the simple, undeniable kindness of his gesture. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the revolver, letting the barrel rest against her leg. Her gaze never left his as she took a hesitant step forward, then another. She moved like a fawn approaching a salt lick, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. When she reached the canteen, She knelt, her eyes still locked on his, and picked it up. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her cracked lips. She drank. She drank as if she had been wandering the desert for days, with a desperation that was painful to watch. Water trickled from the corners of her mouth, tracing clean paths through the grime on her chin. When she was done, she gasped for air, her shoulders slumping with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. She screwed the cap back on with unsteady fingers and placed the canteen back on the ground where he had left it. She didn't say thank you. The shared water was thanks enough. She straightened up but didn't retreat. She stood her ground, the empty revolver still held loosely in her hand, a useless talisman that she couldn't bring herself to discard. They stood there for another long minute, two strangers in a forgotten barn, bound by a moment of shared stillness. Then, outside, the wind picked up. It was a low moan at first, a whisper that rattled a loose shutter on the far side of the barn. It swirled through the open doorway, kicking up dust devils that danced and died on the floor. It was a cool wind, carrying the scent of distant rain, a promise of change in the stagnant air. The wind of the high plains didn't just move air, it moved lives. It altered courses. It blew away the dust of what was and cleared a path for what might be. The gust rattled the crooked barn door, making it groan on its last hinge. For the first time, the girl's eyes flickered away from him, toward the sound, toward the world outside. The spell was broken. The wind had shifted, and with it, something between them had changed too. The silence was no longer one of suspicion, but of quiet assessment. A fragile truce had been declared, not with words, but with a drink of water in the shade of a ruined barn. A journey had ended for him, and a desperate flight had been paused for her. And in that shared moment, under the watchful eyes of the indifferent prairie, a new and uncertain path began. He gave her a long moment to collect herself, to let the water settle in her stomach and the immediate terror recede from her eyes. The wind continued its low moan through the barn, a lonely sound that seemed to underscore their isolation. Dry Hollow was just outside, but it felt a world away. Finally, Cassian retrieved his canteen from the ground, his movement still slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, just capped it and looped the leather thong back over his saddle horn. He checked Boulder's cinch, his hands moving with the easy familiarity of 1,000 repetitions. Every action was a question. What now? Lena watched him, her thin shoulders squared. The empty revolver still hung from her hand, a dead weight. She knew what came next. He would ride away. He was a stranger, a drifter who had offered a moment of kindness. But a man had his own path. Her brief sanctuary was ending. She would be alone again in the gathering dusk, with the shadows growing long and the men she fled somewhere out there, perhaps already searching. A cold dread began to seep back into her bones, chilling her more than the coming night. Cassian finished his check and turned, his gaze settling on her. His face was unreadable, weathered by the elements into a mask of stoicism. He looked at her, then at the vast, darkening expanse of the plains visible through the barn door. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not at her, but toward the open country. "Headed north," he said. The two words were not an invitation, not an offer, just a statement of fact, but the unspoken part hung in the air between them. You can come, or you can stay. It was her choice. He would not force her, nor would he beg. For Lena, who had not had a real choice in years, the simple, unadorned statement was more powerful than any flowery promise of protection. He was giving her agency, a thing more precious than water or food. She looked down at the Colt in her hand, at the useless piece of metal that had been her only companion. It was a symbol of her fear, her defiance, her utter solitude. Slowly, she tucked it into the waistband of her torn dress, a final admission that the bluff was over. She looked back at him and gave a single, sharp nod. He didn't smile, didn't show any sign of relief or satisfaction. He simply walked to Boulder and swung himself up into the saddle. He reached down a hand. It was calloused and steady. A working man's hand. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His grip was firm, impersonal, and he easily pulled her up to sit behind him on the horse's broad rump. There was an initial awkwardness to their proximity. She was pressed against the hard line of his back, her hands hovering uncertainly before finding a tentative purchase on the back of his saddle. She tried to keep a sliver of distance between them, a silent assertion of her own space, but the motion of the horse made it impossible. With every step, Boulder took out of the barn and into the fading light. She was reminded of their enforced intimacy. They left Dry Hollow behind without a backward glance. The town was a bad memory for her, and a place of no consequence for him. The sun was a fiery orange disk touching the horizon, throwing their long, single shadow ahead of them. They rode into a world painted in hues of purple and deep red, a landscape of stark, breathtaking beauty. The silence between them returned, but its character had changed. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of the barn. This was a traveling silence, filled with the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth, the whisper of the wind through sparse prairie grass, and the soft creak of saddle leather. Cassian asked no questions. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or who he was. He understood that a story like hers was a burden, and asking a person to unpack it for a stranger was a cruelty. The details would come if and when they were offered, not before. He rode with an easy slump, his body moving in perfect time with his horse, a man entirely at home in the vast, empty wilderness. He was aware of her behind him, of the slight weight, the occasional, involuntary shift as she tried to find a more comfortable position. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the way she would stiffen every time a coyote howled or the wind rustled a lone cottonwood tree. She was scanning the back trail. He knew, her head constantly turning, her eyes searching the deepening gloom for any sign of pursuit. Lena, for her part, was suspended in a strange state between terror and a fragile, unfamiliar sense of security. The man in front of her was a complete unknown. He could be anything: a bandit, an outlaw, a man no better than the one she'd escaped. Yet, his silence was a comfort. It was not the menacing, watchful silence of her former captor, but a calm, self-contained quiet that asked nothing of her. The steady strength of his back against her hands was a solid, living thing in a world that had become a nightmare of uncertainty. As the miles passed and the last light bled from the sky, her exhaustion began to win its long battle. Her head grew heavy. Once, she swayed, and her cheek brushed against the rough canvas of his duster. She pulled back instantly, a choked apology on her lips, but he gave no sign he had noticed, his posture unchanging. The next time it happened, she let her forehead rest against his back for just a moment, stealing a second of rest. Hours passed. The stars emerged, a brilliant, cold scatter of diamonds on black velvet, more stars than she had ever seen. The air grew sharp and chilly. Cassian rode on, guided by instinct and the celestial map above. He was heading for a place he called home, though the word seemed too grand for what it was. It was well past midnight when he finally drew Boulder to a halt. They were in a small, shallow canyon, a natural shelter carved into the landscape. Ahead, nestled against a sheer rock face that would protect it from the worst of the northern winds, was a dark silhouette, a cabin. He dismounted and, without a word, reached up to help her down. Her legs were stiff and numb, and she nearly stumbled as her feet touched the ground. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow for a moment, then released her. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and grass. A sturdy stone chimney rose from one side, and a single window stared out into the darkness like a vacant eye. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a structure built for one purpose: survival. It was stark, lonely, and as unadorned as the man who had built it. It was barren, but it looked solid. It looked safe. Cassian led the horse to a small corral beside the cabin. unsaddled him, and gave him a rub-down before leaving him with a measure of oats. His care for the animal was gentle and thorough. Lena watched from the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. She felt like a stray, unsure of her place, waiting for the master of the house to either shoo her away or let her in. He finally came to the door, pulling a large iron key from his pocket. The lock groaned in protest as he turned it. He pushed the heavy plank door open and stepped into the absolute blackness within. A moment later, a match scraped, and the soft, warm glow of a kerosene lantern bloomed, pushing the shadows back. He motioned for her to enter. The inside was as simple as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough wool blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves on the far wall held a few tins of food, a bag of flour, some coffee, and a handful of books with worn spines. The place was meticulously clean, spare, and solitary. It was the home of a man who owned little and needed less. Cassian set the lantern on the table, its light casting long, dancing shadows. He didn't look at her as he knelt by the fireplace and began laying wood for a fire. "You can take shelter for a few days," he said, his voice low in the quiet room. "Get your strength back. Then you move on." Lena's heart, which had allowed itself a small flicker of hope, clenched. Of course, it was what she had expected. He owed her nothing. A few days' shelter was a gift, more than she had any right to ask. But the thought of heading back out into that vast, dangerous wilderness alone was suffocating. She looked at his back as he worked, at the deliberate way he placed each piece of kindling, the spark of defiance she'd felt in the barn, the one that had been smothered by fear and exhaustion, stirred again. She would not be a passive recipient of his charity. She would not be a ghost haunting the corner of his life for a few days before disappearing. "If you dare to make soup," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day, "I'll linger till it rains." Cassian paused, a piece of wood in his hand. He slowly turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. It was a strange, almost reckless bargain. In this arid land, waiting for rain could mean waiting a week, or a month, or more. He saw the fire back in her green eyes, a spark of the woman she was beneath the grime and fear. It was a flicker of life, a refusal to be dismissed. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. He turned back to the fireplace and struck another match, touching it to the kindling. Flames licked at the dry wood, catching and growing, breathing warmth and life into the cold stone hearth. He stood up, dusted off his hands, and walked to the shelves without another word. He took down a slab of dried jerky, a few withered potatoes, and an onion. They prepared the meal in an unspoken partnership. He drew a bucket of water from a well out back while she, finding a small knife on the counter, began to peel the potatoes with practiced hands, her movements deft and sure. He sliced the jerky and onion while she chopped the potatoes. He hung a small cast-iron pot over the growing fire, and they added the ingredients and water. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. The simple, shared work of preparing food was a language all its own. Soon, the cabin was filled with the warm, savory smell of simmering soup. It was a humble meal, but to Lena it smelled like the finest feast. They sat at the small table, the firelight playing across their faces, and ate from chipped enamel bowls. Cassian took a spoonful of his own soup and tasted it. His jaw tightened slightly. He'd been heavy-handed with the salt from the jerky. It was nearly brackish. He looked at her, expecting her to grimace, to push the bowl away. Lena ate steadily, her eyes focused on her bowl. She ate as if she hadn't had a warm meal in weeks, which was likely the truth. She finished every last drop, scraping the bottom of the bowl with her spoon. She set it down on the table with a soft click and finally met his gaze across the flickering light. She didn't complain, she didn't say a word, but her clean bowl and the look of quiet, bone-deep gratitude in her eyes said more than words ever could. In the small, sturdy cabin, surrounded by the vast and silent dark, it was enough. It was everything. The first days in Cassian's cabin unfolded with the quiet, deliberate rhythm of a slow sunrise. A routine, unspoken and unwritten, began to form between them. He would rise before the dawn, his movements economical and quiet, and would be gone by the time the first light touched the canyon rim, heading out to check his trap lines or fell a dead tree for firewood. Lena would wake to the lingering scent of coffee and the sight of a full bucket of water he'd left by the door. In his absence, the cabin was her world. At first, she moved through it like a ghost, her footsteps light, terrified of disturbing the profound solitude of the place, of leaving a mark that was not welcome. She scrubbed the floor, mended a tear in his canvas duster with thread pulled from her own torn hem, and organized the sparse contents of his shelves. These were not the chores of a guest, but the instincts of a person trying to establish their worth, to prove they were more than just a mouth to feed. She was paying her way in the only currency she had: care. Cassian would return in the late afternoon, a brace of rabbits or a sack of foraged goods slung over his shoulder. He never commented on the changes she made to the cabin, but he noticed. He saw the way the tin plates were stacked neatly, the way the floor was swept clean of the day's dust, the small bundle of wild mint she'd gathered and left on the table, filling the small room with a fresh, clean scent. He would simply nod, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, and begin preparing their evening meal. The silence remained, but it was no longer the fragile, tense quiet of the first night. It was becoming a comfortable silence, a shared space that didn't need to be filled with chatter. The discovery happened on the fourth day. The afternoon was unusually warm, and Cassian had spent hours splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing through the canyon. He returned to the cabin slick with sweat, his shirt sticking to his back. He stopped at the water barrel he kept just outside the door, stripped off his shirt, and began to wash. Lena was inside, kneading a rough dough for that night's bread, her back to the open doorway. She turned to get the flour sack and froze. He was turned away from her, his broad back and shoulders illuminated by the golden afternoon light. And there, stark against his sun-darkened skin, was the scar. It was not a clean line from a surgeon's knife. It was a vicious, jagged track that started below his left shoulder blade and snaked its way down toward his right hip. The skin was puckered and pale, a roadmap of a past agony written permanently into his flesh. It was the mark of a blade, a Bowie knife or something crueler, wielded with intent. It was the kind of wound that should have killed a man. She felt a sharp intake of breath lodge in her own throat. It was a scar that spoke of a violence that mirrored the terror she carried inside her own soul. He must have felt her eyes on him, or perhaps he heard her silent gasp. He paused, the wet rag in his hand hovering over his skin. He didn't turn around. He simply stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from his torso onto the dry ground. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his shirt, pulling it on over his damp skin. He turned to face her, his expression as impassive as ever. He didn't offer an explanation, and his eyes dared her to ask for one. His past was a locked room, and he was not about to give her the key. Lena looked away quickly, her face burning with a flush of shame for having been caught staring, for intruding on a pain that was not hers. She turned back to her dough and began kneading it with a frantic energy, her knuckles pressing into the soft mass again and again. His scar was visible, a physical testament to a battle he had survived. Hers were hidden, buried so deep she sometimes feared they were the only real part of her left. She carried the scars of her stepfather's house, a place where a child's worth was measured in silence and obedience, where a man's heavy hand and booming voice were the only law. She remembered the gnawing fear of his unpredictable moods, the way her mother would make herself small and invisible, A betrayal that cut Lena deeper than any physical blow ever could. Her mother had taught her not to fight, but to endure, to accept her lot, a lesson that had almost cost Lena her life. Then came the rancher, a man her stepfather had seen as an opportunity. He wasn't just a drunkard, he was a man whose cruelty was a sport. The forced marriage had been a transaction, and she had been the goods. The scar on Cassian's back was a single, violent event in the past. Her scars were 1,000 tiny cuts, inflicted daily, a slow erosion of her spirit until she had become nothing more than a ghost in her own life. Fleeing had been the first choice she had ever truly made for herself, a desperate, ragged scream for the right to simply exist. These memories churned inside her as she worked, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The sight of his scar had unlocked her own. She felt a familiar, chilling wave of panic rise in her chest, the feeling of walls closing in. She had to get out. She had to breathe. Wiping her flour-dusted hands on her dress, she mumbled something about needing herbs and fled the cabin. She didn't stop until she reached a small creek at the bottom of the canyon. She knelt on the muddy bank, drew her knees to her chest, and let the tremors shake her body. He had seen her stare. He would think she was weak, prying. He would think she was trouble. He had given her shelter, and now he would surely take it away. Men always did. Kindness was a currency, and eventually, the bill always came due. The thought of being cast out, of being alone again, was a physical pain. That night, the quiet in the cabin was different. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a taut, humming wire of tension. They ate their meal without looking at each other. Every time he moved, Lena flinched. She felt his gaze on her, assessing, questioning. She was waiting for the verdict, for the words that would send her back into the wilderness. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, the nightmares came for her. They were a thick, suffocating tar of fragmented images, a heavy, liquor-sour breath in her face, her mother's averted eyes, the glint of a belt buckle, the sound of her own name being called like a curse. She woke with a strangled cry, bolting upright on the pallet of blankets he'd made for her by the hearth. The cabin was dark, save for the dying red glow of the coals. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and cold sweat slicked her skin. A shadow moved in the chair by the table. It was Cassian. He was awake, fully dressed, simply sitting in the darkness, watching over the fire. He hadn't been asleep at all. He must have heard her tossing and turning. He didn't speak, didn't move toward her. He just sat there, a silent sentinel in the gloom. The sight of him, so steady and calm, broke something open inside her. The fear and the loneliness and the desperate need for some small anchor in the world swelled up and overflowed. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. "You don't have to say it's okay," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. The words were a torrent, tumbling out of her before she could stop them. "You don't have to say anything at all." She took a ragged breath, the plea of her life resting on her next words. "But don't push me away." It was the most honest thing she had ever said. She wasn't asking for comfort or for promises. She was asking for presence. She was asking him not to turn away from her damage, not to cast her out because she was broken. Cassian looked at her for a long moment, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the embers. His face was a mask of shadows, impossible to read. She expected him to stand up, to tell her it was time to go, that he wasn't equipped to handle this kind of trouble. He had scars of his own. He surely didn't need to take on hers. Instead, he rose from his chair, but he didn't move toward the door. He walked to the wood pile he kept beside the fireplace. He chose 2 thick, seasoned logs of pinon pine and knelt before the hearth. With a quiet, deliberate motion, he placed them carefully onto the dying embers. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at her. He just tended the fire. Lena watched, her breath caught in her throat. A few sparks flew up as the new logs settled, a tiny lick of flame, hesitant at first, tasted the edge of the new wood. Then another, and another. The flames grew, catching and embracing the logs, and a warm, steady light began to push back the oppressive darkness of the cabin. The shadows that had seemed so menacing moments before retreated to the corners of the room. The air grew warmer, chasing away the chill from her skin. She understood. It was an answer more eloquent than any words could ever be. He was not a man of pretty speeches or easy reassurances. He was a man of action, of substance. Placing the logs on the fire was his promise. It said, "I will not let the darkness take you. I will keep the cold at bay. I am here. I am not pushing you away." A profound, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, and the tight knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. She lay back down on her pallet, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin, and watched the fire grow, its light a comforting dance on the log walls. She watched him return to his chair, his duty done. A new kind of silence settled over the cabin. It was not empty. It was filled with a quiet, powerful understanding. It was the silence of acceptance. They were two solitary, scarred souls who had, in the deep of a wilderness night, agreed to stand watch over each other's wounds, and for the first time in a very long time. Lena Ray closed her eyes and felt the stirrings of peace. Weeks bled one into the next, marked not by a calendar, but by the phases of the moon and the slow, steady rhythm of life in the canyon. The quiet acceptance that had been born in the firelight of a desperate night had settled into the very bones of the cabin, becoming a tangible, breathing thing. The silence between Cassian and Lena was no longer a void to be navigated, but a shared language. It was in the way he left a strip of dried apple for her on the table before he left, and the way she ensured there was always a clean rag and a bucket of hot water waiting for him when he returned, caked in the day's grime. They moved around each other in the small space with an unconscious grace, their separate orbits slowly merging into a single, cohesive pattern. He taught her, through gesture and example, how to read the tracks of a deer, how to find water by watching the flight of a finch, how to set a snare so it was both effective and humane. She, in turn, brought a subtle life to his stark existence. She found a patch of wild onions and coaxed them into a small, determined garden. She discovered that the bright yellow flowers growing near the creek could be steeped into a tea that eased the ache in his shoulders after a long day. She learned the specific cadence of his footsteps and could tell, just by the sound, whether his hunt had been successful or not. Lena was healing. The process was as slow and imperceptible as a tree growing through rock. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was gradually being replaced by a watchful calm. She still had nightmares, but they came less frequently, and when they did, she would wake to find a fresh log already glowing on the fire, a silent testament to his continued vigil. She was beginning to understand that Cassian's brand of kindness was not a debt to be repaid, but a simple, elemental fact, as steady and reliable as the stone walls of the canyon itself. Her dress, however, was a constant, fraying reminder of the life she had fled. It was the only garment she owned, and the weeks of hard work had taken their toll. The calico fabric, once a cheerful pattern of small blue flowers, was faded to a uniform, ghostly gray. The original tear at the shoulder had been mended and remended, the stitches a testament to her will to hold herself together. But new rips had appeared, and the hem was permanently stained with a mixture of mud, ash, and berry juice. The dress was a map of her survival, but it was also a cage of memory, heavy with the past. The morning it happened began with a stubborn goat. One of the two goats Cassian kept for milk had found a way out of its pen and had gotten itself stuck in a thicket of thorns down by the creek. It took the better part of an hour for Lena to free the cantankerous animal, a process that involved her wading through thick, sucking mud and getting thoroughly scratched by thorns. By the time she led the goat back to the corral, she was coated in a layer of drying mud from the knees down. Her dress was soaked, and a fresh, three-cornered tear gaped at her hip. The garment clung to her, heavy and cold, smelling of damp earth and her own exertion. She entered the cabin, shivering slightly, pushing a stray, muddy lock of hair from her face. Cassian was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the parts laid out neatly on an oilcloth. He looked up as she came in, his eyes taking in her disheveled state in a single, sweeping glance. He saw the new tear, the mud, the way she hugged her arms to her chest to ward off the chill. His gaze lingered for a moment on the thin, worn fabric of her dress, a garment wholly inadequate for the life she was now living. Without a word, he set down the piece of oiled flannel he was holding, rose from his chair, and went to a small wooden chest that sat at the foot of his cot. It was the only piece of furniture in the cabin that held any mystery, the one place she had never looked. He lifted the lid, rummaged inside for a moment, and pulled out a folded square of clean, homespun cotton. He turned and, with a simple flick of his wrist, tossed it to her. It unfolded in the air, and she caught it reflexively. It was a shirt, his shirt. It was a pale, creamy color, clean and smelling faintly of soap and the dry, warm scent of the sun. It was soft, sturdy, mended neatly at the elbow. It was an object of simple, profound luxury. She stood there, holding the shirt in her hands, the clean fabric a stark contrast to her own soiled dress. And she looked at him, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp suspicion. A cold wave of her old life washed over her. Gifts from men were never free. Clothing, especially. A new dress, a pretty ribbon, these were chains, markers of ownership. They were the price of a roof over her head. A way of saying, "You are mine now." Her mind flashed with images of her stepfather, of the rancher, of transactions where her body and soul were the goods being exchanged. Her guard, which had been slowly, cautiously lowering for weeks, snapped back into place. She clutched the shirt, her knuckles white, her gaze searching his face for the hidden price, for the inevitable demand. Cassian watched the play of emotions on her face, the brief surprise, followed instantly by the familiar shadow of fear and distrust. He saw the walls go up in her eyes, saw her retreat back into the cornered, wounded creature he had first found in the barn. A flicker of something frustration, perhaps, or maybe just a deep, weary sadness passed through him. He had worked for weeks to show her she was safe, and in a single moment, it seemed to be undone. He leaned a hip against the table, crossing his arms over his chest. A rare, dry humor glinted in his eyes. He was not a man for speeches, for long, heartfelt reassurances. That was not his way. His way was to cut directly to the heart of the matter. He raised a single dark eyebrow, a gesture that was surprisingly playful. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gentle rumble, laced with a teasing quality she had never heard from him before. "Take it off," he said. The word struck her like a physical blow. She flinched, a sharp, violent recoil, as if he had raised a hand to her. Every terrible memory she possessed was tied to a man's command to remove a piece of clothing. It was the ultimate violation, the assertion of power, the beginning of the end. Her breath hitched. The clean shirt in her hands suddenly felt like a brand, a tool of her subjugation. The air in the cabin grew thick and suffocating. She stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. But the man leaning against the table was not leering. He was not menacing. The look on his face was not one of lust or demand. It was gentle. The teasing glint was still in his eyes, a quiet challenge to her fear. He was not issuing a command. He was mocking her suspicion, gently prodding at the very walls she had just thrown up between them. "It's just a shirt," his gaze seemed to say. "It's just kindness. Can't you let it be just that?" And in that single charged moment, everything shifted. The weeks of shared silence, of unspoken care, of watching him tend the fire for her in the dead of night, all coalesced into a powerful, undeniable truth. This was Cassian. He was not those other men. He had seen her at her most broken, and he had not turned away. He had scars of his own. He understood. The terror receded, washed away by a sudden, breathtaking wave of clarity, and for the first time since she had known him, a true, genuine smile touched Lena's lips. It was not the small, hesitant twitch she sometimes managed. This was a real smile, a radiant thing that started in her eyes and transformed her entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. The moment of decision was over. She had spent a lifetime recoiling. Now, she would advance. She dropped the clean shirt onto a chair. In 2 quick, silent steps, she closed the distance between them. Before he could react, before the surprise could fully register on his face, she reached up with both hands and fisted them in the collar of his shirt. She tugged, not hard, but with a firm, undeniable pressure, pulling his head down toward hers. The teasing light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of profound, stunned stillness. He was so close now she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could count the individual lashes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The world narrowed to the few inches that separated their faces. She tilted her head up, her lips almost brushing his. Her voice was a low, intense whisper, a current of pure, undiluted emotion that was for him and him alone. It was a surrender, but it was also a demand. It was her choice, her terms, her reclamation of a phrase that had once been used to cage her. "Make me yours," she breathed. The words hung in the supercharged air between them, more intimate than any touch, more binding than any kiss. It was the answer to his unspoken offer, the acceptance of his unspoken care. It was her entire past and her fragile hope for the future, laid bare in a single, audacious command. He did not move. He did not kiss her. She did not kiss him. There was no touch of skin on skin, save for her hands on his collar and the phantom heat where their bodies almost met. There was only the space between them, a space so filled with unspoken promises that it felt more solid than the log walls around them. Their breath mingled, his smelling of coffee, hers of the wild, rain-washed air. It was a quiet, elemental exchange, the first true sharing of themselves. A lifetime passed in that silent, breathless moment. It was the first promise, an unspoken covenant made not of vows and rings, but of a clean shirt, a gentle tease, and a whispered challenge in a sunlit cabin, deep in the heart of the wilderness. They stood there, locked in that gaze, while the world outside continued on, unaware that inside the small room, everything had just begun. The quiet covenant forged between them in the pre-dawn light held for many weeks, a fragile peace that felt as vast and profound as the canyon itself. The world shrank to the dimensions of their small homestead, the cabin, the creek, the corral, the ring of silent, watchful mesas. In this protected space, Lena's spirit, so long battered and bruised, began to uncurl like a leaf seeking the sun. She wore Cassian's shirt, patched and washed and worn soft. As a second skin, it was a shield, a comfort, a silent declaration. She learned the landscape of his face as well as she was learning the landscape of the canyon, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when a hawk soared overhead, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was deep in thought. But the canyon was not the whole world. Their supplies began to run low. Coffee, flour, salt, and, most critically, kerosene for the lamp that held the deep night at bay. A trip to a larger town, a place called Red Rock Crossing, became unavoidable. It was a 2-day ride, a necessary journey into the world of men and memories they had so carefully walled out. The ride to Red Rock was different from their first journey together. Lena no longer sat behind him, a frightened passenger. Cassian had bartered for a gentle-tempered mare from a passing Ute trapper, and Lena now rode beside him. She sat her horse with a newfound confidence, her back straight, her gaze no longer scanning the back trail in terror, but taking in the sweep of the plains with a quiet appreciation. They spoke little, as was their way, but the silence was one of easy companionship. For the first time, Lena felt not like a fugitive, but like a traveler on a journey with a trusted partner. Red Rock Crossing was a shock to her system. It was a bustling, noisy hub, a stark contrast to the desolate quiet of Dry Hollow and the deep peace of the canyon. The main street was a river of wagons, riders, and dust. The air, thick with the smell of livestock, wood smoke, and frying bacon, hummed with the cacophony of 100 conversations, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, and the tinny, cheerful sound of a piano drifting from a saloon. For a moment, standing in the middle of the crowded general store, Lena felt a flicker of something she had long forgotten normalcy. She ran her hand over a bolt of dark blue calico, the simple, clean texture a world away from her worn-out dress. Cassian stood beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the swirling chaos. He was buying cartridges for his Colt, his movements calm and economical, his quiet nature a small island of stillness in the boisterous room. It was then that the wind changed. A man stood by the counter, paying for a twist of tobacco. He was burly, with a florid face and small, piggish eyes set too close together. He wore the dusty, sweat-stained clothes of a ranch hand. As he turned, his gaze swept the store and fell upon Lena. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. Then, a slow, dawning recognition spread across his features, followed by a look of sly, malicious satisfaction. It was Jedediah, the foreman from the ranch. He was the one who had held her arms while the rancher. He was the one whose laughter had been the soundtrack to some of her worst memories. Lena's blood ran cold. The bolt of fabric felt like ice beneath her fingers. The noise of the store faded to a distant roar, and the air grew thin, impossible to breathe. The fragile peace she had so carefully constructed over the past weeks shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was no longer Lena of the canyon. She was the rancher's property. Found. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she took an involuntary step back, bumping into Cassian. He didn't need to ask. He had been watching, as he always was. He had seen the man, had seen the ugly shift in his expression, and had felt the instantaneous, violent tremor that ran through Lena. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, a brief, firm pressure that was both a steadying touch and a silent command. "I am here." He finished his transaction, his voice as calm and even as ever. "We're done here," he said, his words for her alone. He guided her out of the store, his body a shield between her and Jedediah's triumphant, lingering gaze. They gathered their supplies and left Red Rock Crossing without another word, the cheerful noise of the town now sounding menacing and false. The ride back was a regression. Lena was once again the terrified fugitive, her body rigid, her eyes locked on the horizon behind them. The easy silence was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken dread. Cassian rode beside her, his face set in stone, his hand never straying far from the worn grip of his Colt. He knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who understood the cruelties of the world, that it was not over. It had only just begun. Back in the false security of the saloon, Jedediah bought a bottle of cheap whiskey and approached a table in the corner where 3 men sat playing a greasy game of cards. They were not cowboys or townsfolk. They had the hard, predatory look of men who made their living on the edges of the law. Their clothes were worn, their faces unshaven, and their eyes were constantly moving, assessing every person in the room for weakness. Jedediah slammed the bottle down on the table, making the cards jump. "A word," he grunted. The leader, a lean man with a scar that split his left eyebrow, looked up with cold annoyance. "Make it quick. Pike's cheating. My boss, Mr. Abram, he lost something of value a few months back." Jedediah began, pouring 4 glasses. "A piece of property. Young, brown hair, green eyes. Answers to the name Lena." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. I just saw her. She's with some quiet drifter. They're headed back into the canyons, north of here." The scarred man, Silas, took a slow sip of whiskey. "Property don't just wander off. What's the job?" "He wants her back," Jedediah said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He's offering a reward, $50. He wants her brought back, unharmed, mostly. But he wants her to know she's been found. He wants her scared. The drifter," he shrugged, "is an inconvenience. Deal with him as you see fit." Silas exchanged a look with his two companions, a hulking, simple-looking man named Boone and a wiry, rat-faced man called Pike. $50 was a good purse for a simple retrieval, and the freedom to deal with the inconvenience was a bonus. "We'll find your lost property," Silas said, a humorless grin spreading across his face. "For that price, we'll bring her back gift-wrapped." 2 days later, back in the canyon, the oppressive weight of what had happened in town had not lifted. Lena moved like a wraith, starting at every sound, her appetite gone, the light in her eyes extinguished. Cassian watched her, his silence a heavy, protective blanket. He did not offer empty words of comfort. The threat was real, and platitudes were useless against it. The wind had changed, and it now carried the scent of a coming storm. That afternoon, he did not go out. He stayed in the cabin and undertook a quiet, methodical ritual. He laid an oilcloth on the table and completely disassembled his Colt peacemaker, cleaning every screw, spring, and chamber with a focused intensity that was almost prayerful. He did the same with his old hunting rifle. They were good weapons, reliable and familiar, but he knew they might not be enough. The next morning, he saddled Boulder. "Stay inside," he told Lena. It was not a request. "Keep the door barred." He rode out, not toward his trap lines, but back toward the east, in the direction of Red Rock. He returned late the next day. Lena, who had spent a sleepless, terrifying 36 hours alone, unbarred the door as he rode in. He slid from the saddle, a long, cloth-wrapped object in his hand. He walked past her into the cabin and laid it on the table. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a new rifle, a Winchester, its wooden stock smooth and dark, its brass receiver gleaming in the lamplight. It was a beautiful, deadly piece of machinery, a weapon far superior to his old hunting gun. It was his answer to Jedediah, to the rancher, to the threat that was now hunting them. It was a declaration of war. He had spent a significant portion of his cattle drive pay, not on comforts or supplies, but on this, on her defense. Lena stared at the rifle, at the statement it made. This was real. He was preparing to fight, perhaps to die, for her. The thought was both terrifying and deeply, profoundly moving. She had spent her life being told she was worthless, a piece of property. This man was willing to stake his own life on her freedom. The knowledge was a fire in her belly, burning away the cold tendrils of fear. She would not be a damsel to be rescued. She would not be the prize in a bloody fight between men. This was her battle. The ghosts were hers to face. She waited until he had finished cleaning and oiling the new weapon, until he was sighting down the barrel at an imaginary target outside the window. She came and stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Cassian," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. He lowered the rifle and looked at her. "If it comes to it," she began, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. "If they come here, will you let me handle it myself?" It was the hardest question she had ever asked. She was asking him to trust her, to respect her, to see her not as a victim in need of saving, but as a partner capable of defending herself. She was asking him to risk letting her fail, to risk her life on her own terms. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the fierce, desperate resolve in her eyes. He saw the woman who had survived unspeakable things, the woman who had offered a defiant bargain in a dusty cabin, the woman who had pulled his head down and claimed him with a whisper. He understood what she was asking. She needed to be the one to pull the trigger on her own past, to silence the ghosts, for good. To deny her, that would be to deny her the very freedom he was prepared to fight for. He nodded slowly, a single, solemn motion. "I'll be standing right behind you," he said, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. "But I'll be standing there." It was the most profound promise he could have made. He would not take the fight from her, but he would not let her face it alone. He would be her shadow, her support, the unbreachable wall at her back. A tear, hot and sharp, escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. The next morning, he took her to a secluded box canyon a mile from the cabin. He didn't hand her the new Winchester. He gave her his own Colt, the gun that was an extension of his own hand. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights on a row of tin cans he'd set on a fallen log 50 feet away. Her first shot was a deafening explosion that made her flinch, the kick of the gun jarring her entire arm. The bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the cans. Her second and third shots were no better. The frustration and the old, familiar feeling of failure began to creep in. "You're closing your eyes," Cassian said quietly from behind her. "Keep them open. See the target. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She raised the heavy pistol again, forcing her eyes to stay open, focusing on one can until it was the only thing in her world. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked, but this time she was ready for it. A satisfying clang echoed through the canyon as one of the cans flew into the air. A neat hole punched through its center. A fierce, triumphant joy surged through her. She lowered the gun, her arm trembling, and turned to look at him. He wasn't smiling, but there was a look of profound, quiet approval in his eyes. She turned back to the targets, raised the pistol, and fired again. And again. The sound of gunshots echoed through the canyon. No longer a sound of terror from her past, but a new sound. It was the sound of Lena Ray, learning how to fight back. The daily target practice became their new liturgy. Every morning, after a breakfast of coffee and hard biscuits, Cassian would lead her to the box canyon, and the quiet would be shattered by the concussive bark of the Colt. The ritual was grim, a constant acknowledgement of the storm gathering just over the horizon. The smell of gunpowder clung to Lena's hands and hair, a scent that was both a repellent to her past and a constant reminder of the violence that might define her future. She was getting better. Her hands no longer shook when she held the heavy pistol, and her flinch was almost gone. She could now consistently hit the tin cans from 50 feet, the satisfying clang of the bullet striking metal a small, fierce victory each time. But the practice was hollowing her out. It was a life lived in a state of constant, coiled tension, a life braced for an attack. The fragile peace she had found in the canyon was being eroded by the very action she was taking to defend it. The silence in the cabin was no longer comfortable. It was watchful. The canyon walls, once a protective embrace, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. The land itself seemed to hold its breath with them. The sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity. The creek slowed to a trickle. The dust, fine as flour, coated everything. A gritty film on the plates, in their clothes, on their skin. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static tension that mirrored their own. Then, one afternoon, the change came. It began not with a sound, but with a shift in the light. The relentless glare of the sun softened, muted by a high, thin veil of gray that slid across the sky from the west. The wind, which had been a hot, listless whisper for weeks, picked up a sudden, restless energy, rustling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods and carrying a strange, new scent. It was the smell of ozone and distant, damp earth. Lena was scrubbing a pot by the cabin door when she felt the first drop. It was a single, fat droplet that landed on the back of her hand, startlingly cold against her warm skin. She looked down at the dark, spreading spot, then up at the bruised-looking sky. Another drop hit her cheek, then another landed in the dust at her feet, raising a tiny puff of powder before being instantly absorbed. Cassian came to stand beside her in the doorway. His gaze also turned to the heavens. He tilted his face up, letting the sporadic drops hit his skin, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you're lingering," he said, his voice a low rumble. It took her a moment to understand. Then she remembered her own words from that first, desperate night, the strange bargain she had offered. "I'll linger till it rains." A small, incredulous laugh escaped her. It felt like a lifetime ago. The rain had come. What began as a hesitant spatter soon became a steady, determined drumming on the cabin's sod roof. The sound was a miracle, a living, breathing thing that filled the world, washing away the oppressive silence. They stood together on the small porch, under the protection of the eaves, and watched the downpour. The dust that had plagued them for weeks was being tamed, turning the ground a dark, rich brown. The air, scrubbed clean, smelled of creosote and wet pine. The parched land was drinking, and with every drop that fell, Lena felt the tight, dry knot of fear inside her begin to soften and dissolve. The sight of so much clean, free water sparked an idea. It was a simple, domestic impulse, a sudden, urgent need to do something normal, something other than load and fire a gun. "The blankets," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining with an idea that felt brilliant and radical. "We should wash the blankets." His gaze shifted from the rain to her face. He saw the genuine, unburdened excitement there, a light he hadn't seen since they had walked into that general store in Red Rock. He saw her desire to connect with this moment of reprieve, to embrace the gift the sky was giving them. He gave a slow, single nod. The work was hard and joyful. They dragged his large wooden wash tub out from under the cabin and positioned it under the steadiest cascade of water pouring from the roof. They hauled the heavy wool blankets, musty with the scent of wood smoke and dust, out into the downpour. The rain was cold, but the effort of their work soon warmed them. They worked as a team, a silent, efficient partnership. He would hold one end of a heavy, waterlogged blanket, and she would hold the other. And together they would twist, wringing out the grime. Then they would plunge it back into the tub, scrubbing at it with a coarse bar of lye soap until the water ran brown. They had to empty and refill the tub 3 times, the clean rainwater a precious, inexhaustible resource. At one point, as Cassian was heaving a particularly sodden blanket over a wooden beam on the porch, a small river of soapy water cascaded down, splashing directly onto Lena's head and shoulders. She gasped at the shock of it, sputtering, and then a sound bubbled up from her chest, a sound so unfamiliar she barely recognized it as her own. It was a laugh, a full, free, joyous peal of laughter that echoed under the drumming of the rain. Cassian froze, the blanket still in his hands, and stared at her. He had never heard her laugh before. The sound transformed her, erasing the last traces of the haunted girl from the barn and revealing the vibrant young woman who had been buried beneath. Her face was flushed, her hair was plastered to her head, and she was radiant. A slow smile spread across his own face, a rare and genuine thing that eased the harsh lines around his eyes. Seeing his smile, Lena laughed even harder. It felt good, like stretching a muscle that had been cramped for years. On impulse, she scooped up a handful of water from the tub and flicked it at him. It hit him square in the chest, darkening his shirt. He looked down at the wet spot, then back up at her, a playful glint in his eyes. And for the next few minutes, the grim work of washing was forgotten, replaced by a spontaneous, childish water fight under the shelter of the porch, their laughter mingling with the steady rhythm of the rain. When their energy was spent, they stood leaning against the cabin wall, breathless and soaked, surrounded by the clean, damp smell of wool and wet wood. The blankets, heavy and dark, hung from the beams, dripping steadily onto the porch floor. The rain had softened to a gentle, persistent shower. The world felt new, washed clean, brimming with a quiet sense of possibility. Lena turned her head to look at him. His dark hair was slick with rain, and droplets clung to his eyelashes. The smile lingered on his lips, a soft, unguarded expression that made her heart ache with a feeling she couldn't name. In that moment, he was not the silent, scarred protector, the grim instructor with a pistol. He was just a man, standing in the rain, with a quiet joy in his eyes. Overwhelmed by a sudden, powerful wave of gratitude for the rain, for the laughter, for the simple, profound fact of his presence, she did something she had never dared to do. She reached out, placed a hand gently on his arm, rose up on her toes, and pressed a light, soft kiss to his cheek. His skin was cool and damp from the rain, rough with a day's worth of stubble. The contact was brief, a feather-light touch, but it sent a jolt through both of them, as potent and surprising as a lightning strike. Cassian went absolutely still. A dark, immediate blush crept up from the collar of his wet shirt, flooding his neck and face. It was a startling sight on a man so self-contained. He broke her gaze, turning his head away abruptly, staring out at the rain-swept canyon as if its geography held some sudden, vital importance. His body was a statue, rigid with a mixture of shock and an emotion she couldn't decipher. She felt a pang of fear. She had overstepped. She had broken the unspoken rules of their quiet world. But then, as quickly as he had turned away, he turned back. His face was still flushed, but his eyes met hers directly. The surprise was still there, but it was mingled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability that took her breath away. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In that single motion, turning away in instinct and turning back in a conscious choice, he had shown her everything. He was not rejecting her gesture. He was struggling to accept it, to find a place for this new, gentle intimacy in the hard, scarred landscape of his soul. The rain fell softly around them, a gentle curtain that separated them from the rest of the world. Lena looked at his face, at the blush still staining his cheeks, at the profound sincerity in his eyes, and a vision of the future, a thing she had not dared to imagine for years, bloomed in her mind with a sudden, aching clarity. "If I live to be old," she said, her voice a near whisper, but steady and clear in the quiet afternoon. "If I get to have gray hair, I want an afternoon just like this, every week." It was more than a wish. It was a confession. It was a prayer. The if hung between them, a stark acknowledgement of the danger that still lurked outside the circle of the rain. But the rest of it, the vision of a long life filled with simple, shared joys like this, was an act of audacious hope. It was the first time she had spoken of a future, and it was a future that undeniably, unequivocally, included him. He didn't answer with words. His throat worked, but none came. Instead, he simply looked at her, and in his gaze she saw her own hope reflected back. He understood. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he raised his arms. It was not a sudden or passionate movement. It was a deliberate, almost hesitant motion. He reached for her, and she stepped into his embrace, her hands finding a place on his strong, solid back. He held her. His arms circled her completely, pulling her against the damp wool of his shirt. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. It was not a hurried, desperate embrace. It was a slow, deep settling. It was the embrace of two people who had found a harbor in a storm. He held her with a strength that was not confining, but grounding. A strength that said, "You are safe here." She leaned into him, letting his solidness absorb the last of her tremors, the last of her fears. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the eaves of the small cabin while the rare, precious rain fell around them. They didn't need to speak. In the solid weight of his arms and the trusting surrender of her body, everything was said. They both knew, with a certainty that was as elemental and true as the rain itself, that they were no longer just two strangers surviving together. They were building something real, something to fight for, something to last. The rare peace brought by the rain lingered for 2 more days, a gentle, healing balm on the raw nerves of the world. The canyon was alive, the creek running full and clear, the air washed clean and smelling of damp sage and pine. Inside the cabin, a quiet transformation had taken place. The embrace on the porch had changed the space between them, charging it with a new, unspoken intimacy. They moved with a heightened awareness of each other. A simple brush of hands as they passed the table becoming a significant event. The threat that had driven them together now seemed to be the very thing that was forging them into something unbreakable. But Cassian knew it was a false peace, a lull in the storm. He spent the daylight hours fortifying the cabin in small, unobtrusive ways. He strengthened the bar on the door, wedged new supports under the window shutters, and cleared a wider field of fire around the small homestead, his actions methodical and grim. Lena watched him, her heart a heavy, anxious knot in her chest. She continued her target practice, but now there was a new urgency to it. Every clang of a bullet hitting a tin can was a prayer for a steady hand when the time came. She also made her own preparations. Cassian had a small store of supplies he'd accumulated over years of solitary living: sulfur for matches, saltpeter for curing meat, charcoal from the fire. Lena, remembering things her grandmother had taught her about poultices and folk remedies, saw another use for them. She spent an afternoon grinding the ingredients with a stone pestle, mixing them with sugar from their dwindling supplies and a bit of dried moss. She packed the fine, dark powder into 3 small, tightly sewn deerskin pouches. When Cassian saw what she was doing, he stopped and watched her for a long moment. His eyes narrowed in thought. He recognized the basic components of black powder, but her additions were new to him. "It'll make more smoke than fire," she explained quietly, not looking up from her work. "The sugar makes it burn thick and slow. It's for confusion, not for harm." He said nothing, but a look of deep, profound respect entered his eyes. He had given her a gun to defend herself. She had fashioned a tool to defend them both with her mind. The attack came on the 3rd night. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, and a low-lying mist had crept into the canyon, muffling all sound and turning the familiar landscape into a ghostly, uncertain world. They had just finished their meager supper when Boulder, Cassian's ever-watchful horse, gave a low, nervous snort from the corral. Instantly, Cassian was on his feet, every line of his body alert. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the thick wood. Lena's heart leaped into her throat, the taste of fear coppery and sharp on her tongue. The peaceful silence of the canyon was gone, replaced by a listening, predatory stillness that was far more terrifying. Cassian turned from the door, his face a grim mask in the lamplight. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand and extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, save for the faint, dying glow of the embers in the hearth. The sudden blackness was disorienting, but Cassian moved through it with the sureness of a blind man in his own home. Lena heard the soft, metallic click as he cocked his new Winchester rifle. Then a voice cut through the misty night, startlingly close. It was a cruel, confident drawl she would never forget. "I know you're in there. Girl, Mr. Abram is getting impatient. Come on out, and maybe we won't have to ruin that pretty face of yours. Your friend can even live, if he's smart." It was Silas. The sound of his voice was a physical violation, a ghost from her past stepping into the sanctuary of her present. A tremor of pure terror ran through her, so violent it nearly buckled her knees. But then she felt a hand on her arm in the darkness. It was Cassian. His grip was firm, steady, a silent transfer of strength. He leaned close, his breath warm by her ear. "The window by the hearth," he whispered. "Remember what I showed you?" His voice, calm and unshaken, was the anchor she needed. The terror did not vanish, but a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize around it. This was her fight. She would not be property. She would not be dragged back. She nodded in the dark, her hand finding the cold, familiar grip of the Colt he had left for her on the mantelpiece. A bullet suddenly ripped through the wooden shutter of the main window. The sound, a deafening crack, followed by the tinkle of glass from the pane behind it. Wood splintered inwards, a piece stinging Lena's cheek. The siege had begun. "That was your last chance," Silas roared from the darkness. Cassian was already moving. "The back window," he breathed to Lena. "When I throw it, they'll look that way. Be ready." He crept to the small, single window at the rear of the cabin, the one that looked out toward the sheer canyon wall. He pulled one of Lena's deerskin pouches from his pocket. He took a burning twig from the hearth, touched it to the fuse she had fashioned from a piece of oiled twine, and, in a single fluid motion, unbarred the small shutter and tossed the pouch out into the misty darkness. It landed with a soft thud. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the pouch erupted with a loud, hissing roar. It didn't explode. It vomited a thick, roiling cloud of greasy, impenetrable black smoke. The sugar and moss did their work, creating a foul, acrid screen that billowed out, clinging to the damp night air. Shouts of confusion and surprise came from outside, followed by a volley of panicked shots fired blindly in the direction of the smoke. It was the diversion they needed. "Now," Cassian said, already moving to his position by the main door, his Winchester ready. Lena was at her window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were surprisingly steady on the grip of the Colt. The world had narrowed to this small slice of darkness, smoke, and danger. She could see shapes moving in the swirling mist, disoriented by the smoke. One of the shapes stumbled into a small clearing not 30 feet from her window. It was the rat-faced man, Pike, coughing and waving the smoke away from his face, his pistol held uncertainly. For a split second, their eyes met through the gloom. She saw the surprise and malice in his face. He started to raise his gun. "Keep your eyes open. Squeeze." Cassian's words were a lifeline in the chaos. Lena took a breath, lined up the sights just as he had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the Colt inside the small cabin was a physical force, a deafening thunder that seemed to shake the very logs. The recoil slammed her arm back, but she held on. Through the crack, she saw Pike's body jerk violently, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He made a soft, surprised sound, like a sigh, and then crumpled to the ground, disappearing into the mist. Nausea, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. She had just killed a man. The finality of it was a crushing weight, but there was no time for shock, no time for horror. The other two men, realizing they had been tricked, let out enraged roars and opened fire on the cabin in earnest. Bullets tore through the log walls, a deadly, percussive drumming. Wood splintered. Pots and pans on the shelves were flung to the floor with loud clangs, and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and shattered pine. Lena crouched below the window, reloading the Colt with trembling but determined fingers, the simple, mechanical action keeping the overwhelming reality of what she had just done at bay. Cassian was a ghost of deadly efficiency in the darkness. He fired the Winchester in controlled, single shots, his muzzle flashes brief, brilliant stars in the gloom. He didn't waste ammunition. Each shot was aimed. After a rapid exchange, a heavy, wet scream came from the direction of the corral, followed by the thud of a large body falling. Boone, the hulking one, was down. One left, Silas. The shooting from outside stopped. A tense, waiting silence descended. broken only by Lena's ragged breathing and the soft hiss of the dying smoke cloud. Silas was the smart one, the dangerous one. He wasn't going to make another blind rush. "You're dead, drifter!" Silas screamed, his voice strained with rage and perhaps fear. "And the girl's gonna watch." "Stay low," Cassian breathed, his voice tight. He was moving, a shadow among shadows, to a new position. He'll try the door. They waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Lena could feel the warm, sticky trickle of blood on her cheek where the splinter had cut her. The adrenaline was a roaring fire in her veins. She was no longer just afraid. She was filled with a cold, clear rage. This man, this ghost from her past, would not take this new life from her. The attack came with a sudden, crashing violence. Silas, using the last of the smoke and mist for cover, launched himself at the weakest point, the main window, already damaged by the first bullet. He hit it with his full weight, the wooden shutter cracking and groaning. One of his arms, holding a pistol, punched through the splintered wood, firing blindly into the cabin. Lena was closer. She saw the arm, the gun, the flash of fire. A searing, white-hot pain tore through her left shoulder. It felt as if she had been branded with a hot iron. She cried out, stumbling back, the Colt slipping from her numb fingers. The bullet had only grazed her, but the shock and pain were immense. Cassian fired the Winchester at the same moment, his shot going through the door toward where he thought Silas would be. He was met with a grunt of pain, but not a final one. He worked the lever action to chamber another round, but it jammed. A spent cartridge had failed to eject properly. "Cassian!" Lena screamed, seeing the rifle was useless. Silas, wounded but alive, roared in triumph and heaved his body through the shattered window frame. For a terrifying second, he was silhouetted there, a monster of vengeance blocking out the misty night. He saw Cassian struggling with the jammed rifle, saw Lena clutching her wounded shoulder, and a predator's grin split his face. He had won. But as he brought his pistol to bear on Cassian, his eyes flicked to Lena, and the grin faltered. He didn't see a crying, defeated victim. He saw a woman filled with a fury that burned brighter than any pain, with a cry that was part rage, part agony. Lena lunged for the fallen Colt. Her wounded arm was a useless, burning weight, but her right hand was steady. She scooped up the pistol from the floor, cocked the hammer with her thumb, and raised it in a single, fluid motion. She didn't aim for long. She didn't have to. He filled her world. She saw the man who had held her down, the man who had come to drag her back to a living hell, the man who had just shot her and was about to kill the only person who had ever shown her true kindness. She kept her eyes open. She squeezed the trigger. The final shot was the loudest of all. Silas's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a look of utter, complete surprise. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, and then toppled out of the window frame, landing with a heavy, final thud on the damp ground outside. Silence. A profound, ringing, absolute silence descended on the small cabin. It was over. The only sounds were the soft dripping of rain from the eaves, the frantic pounding of Lena's own heart, and Cassian's harsh, ragged breathing. "Lena!" His voice was a raw whisper in the dark. "I'm here," she gasped, the Colt falling from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. The strength that had sustained her vanished, and she sagged against the wall, a wave of dizziness and pain washing over her. He was beside her in an instant, his hands gently probing her shoulder. He lit the lamp, the sudden light harsh and revealing. The cabin was a complete wreck. The walls were pocked with bullet holes, the floor littered with splintered wood, broken crockery, and spent shell casings. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and gunpowder. He examined her shoulder. "It's a deep graze. It went clean through the muscle," he said, his voice tight with a controlled fury she knew was not directed at her. He worked quickly. tearing a strip from one of their clean, newly washed blankets to staunch the bleeding. As he tended to her wound, his touch gentle despite the urgency, Lena looked around at the devastation. She saw the dead man lying just outside the window, his face turned to the uncaring stars. She looked at the splintered walls, the shattered remnants of their quiet life. She looked at Cassian's face, grim and smoke-stained in the lamplight. They had survived. They were alive. The absurdity of it, the sheer, violent impossibility of what they had just endured, struck her with the force of a physical blow. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. Cassian looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Lena." The sound came again, louder this time. It was a laugh. It was a wild, unhinged, hysterical sound, bubbling up from a place of pure shock and relief. It was the sound of a soul that had been stretched to the breaking point and had not snapped. Cassian stared at her for a moment, his face a mask of confusion. Then he looked around at the bullet-riddled cabin, at the bodies outside, at the smoking ruin of their peace. He looked back at her face, tear-streaked and dirty, her eyes shining with a wild, brilliant light, and a slow, answering smile touched his own lips. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, then grew into a full, deep laugh that joined hers. They sat there, amidst the wreckage of their home, two survivors, one wounded, both exhausted, and they laughed. They laughed until the tears streamed down their faces, a raw, primal, and utterly sane response to the madness they had just overcome. They were alive, together, and in that moment, that was the only thing in the entire world that mattered. The laughter of the previous night was a ghost in the cold morning air. It had been a necessary madness, a pressure valve for a terror too immense to be contained. But dawn brought with it the stark, silent reality of the wreckage. The cabin, their sanctuary, was violated, scarred, a physical testament to the battle they had endured. Lena woke on her pallet, a dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder, a constant reminder of the fight. The wound had been cleaned and tightly bandaged by Cassian, his hands surprisingly gentle and sure. He was already awake, standing by the splintered window frame, looking out at the mist-shrouded canyon. He held his Winchester, not as a threat, but with a weary familiarity, like a carpenter holding his most essential tool. The sight of the destruction in the flat, unforgiving light of day was worse than it had been in the flickering lamplight. Bullet holes peppered the log walls like a pox. The floor was a treacherous landscape of broken glass, shattered pottery, and spent cartridges. A dark, ugly stain marked the spot where Silas had fallen. The air was thick with the lingering, metallic smell of old blood and gunpowder. They didn't speak. There were no words for the morning after a siege. Cassian turned from the window, his eyes meeting hers across the ruined room. His face was etched with a profound exhaustion, but his gaze was steady, resolute. In his eyes, she saw not despair, but a quiet, unyielding determination. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the door, and she understood. The work had to begin. The first task was the grimmest. Cassian went out alone. Lena watched through the broken window as he dragged the three bodies, one by one, to a shallow ravine 100 yards from the cabin. There was no ceremony, no malice in his actions, only a grim, practical finality. He was a man of the wilderness, and he understood its unforgiving calculus. These men had brought death to his door, and the wilderness was now reclaiming them. He returned to the cabin, took a shovel, and went back to the ravine. Lena watched him work for a long time, the rhythmic scrape and thud of his labor the only sound in the canyon. When he finally came back, his face was slick with sweat, his jaw set like stone. He said nothing of what he had done, and she asked nothing. The ghosts had been laid to rest. Then, together, they began to reclaim their home. It was a slow, arduous process. They worked in a shared, purposeful silence, each anticipating the other's needs. Lena, her left arm held stiffly at her side, swept the debris into a pile while Cassian carefully prized the flattened lead slugs from the log walls with the tip of his knife. He pulled them out, one by one, a harvest of violence, and dropped them into a tin can with a series of dull, final clinks. He spent the rest of the morning repairing the shattered window shutter, his hammer blows echoing the gunshots of the night before. But this time they were a sound of construction, not destruction. Lena took a bucket and a rag and scrubbed the floorboards where Silas had fallen. She scrubbed until her good arm ached and the wood was pale and clean, chasing the last shadow of the man from their home. They worked through the day, patching, mending, cleaning, restoring, with every bullet hole plugged with a whittled piece of pine, with every shard of glass swept away. They were not just repairing a building, they were healing a wound. They were asserting their right to be there, their refusal to be driven out by fear. By evening, the cabin was transformed. It was not the same. The scars remained the patched walls, the new, raw wood of the shutter, but it was whole again. It was theirs. As the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows into the canyon, a new, deeper quiet settled over them, the quiet of shared survival. A bond forged in the crucible of a shared fight. 2 days later, a new routine had begun to take hold, one marked by a quiet, watchful peace. As Cassian was mending a piece of tack on the porch, he suddenly went still, his head lifting, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the canyon. Lena, who was tending her small garden, felt a familiar lurch of fear. She straightened up, her hand instinctively going to her wounded shoulder. "It's all right," Cassian said, his voice calm. "It's just the boy." A few minutes later, a figure appeared, riding a shaggy, dust-colored pony. It was a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with a thatch of unruly brown hair and the bright, curious eyes of a chipmunk. He was wiry and tanned, dressed in patched overalls and a faded shirt, a small, worn bedroll tied behind his saddle. He rode with the easy, unthinking confidence of a child who has spent more time on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He spotted Cassian on the porch and his face broke into a wide, unrestrained grin. "Cassian!" he yelled, his young voice echoing in the quiet canyon. He kicked his pony into a canter, pulling up in a cloud of dust before sliding to the ground. "Tom," Cassian said, and a rare, soft smile touched his lips. He rose and met the boy, placing a large, gentle hand on his shoulder. "The parson's wife feed you enough?" "She tried," the boy said, grinning, "but I think I still shrunk." It was then that Tom saw Lena, standing hesitantly by her garden patch. His grin faltered, replaced by a look of open, unabashed curiosity, mixed with a hint of suspicion. He looked from Lena to Cassian and back again. His brow furrowed. "Who's she?" he asked, his voice a stage whisper that carried easily in the still air. "This is Lena," Cassian said simply. "She's staying here." The introduction was as spare and unadorned as everything else about the man, but it was laden with a profound significance. "She's staying here," it was a statement of fact, a declaration of permanence. Lena felt a warmth spread through her chest. Tom regarded her with the solemn, unwavering scrutiny that only a child can manage. He was Cassian's boy, in a way. Cassian had found him 2 years prior, a half-starved orphan hiding in the ruins of a burned-out wagon train, the sole survivor of a cholera outbreak. Cassian had taken him in, and, for a few months each year, sent him to a small mission school in a settlement 3 days' ride away, wanting the boy to learn his letters and numbers, to have a chance at a life beyond trapping and solitude. The initial days with Tom were a period of careful navigation. The boy was used to having Cassian's undivided, if silent, attention. He now had to share it. He watched Lena constantly, his bright eyes missing nothing, trying to understand her place in this silent man's world. Lena, in turn, was unsure how to act. She had never been around children. She treated him with a gentle, cautious respect, never pushing, never prying, simply letting him get used to her presence. The breakthrough came a week later, over the woodpile. It was Tom's chore to split the kindling for the fire. He attacked the task with a boyish bravado, swinging the small hatchet with more force than skill, his blows often glancing off the logs or missing entirely. Cassian was gone for the day, checking his more distant trap lines. Lena sat on the porch steps, mending one of Tom's shirts, watching him struggle. He grunted with frustration as the hatchet bounced off a particularly stubborn piece of pine for the third time. "You're fighting it," she said quietly. Tom stopped and looked at her, his face flushed with exertion and a hint of annoyance at being corrected. "I am not," he retorted. Lena set aside her sewing and walked over to him. She didn't scold him or take the hatchet from him. "Give me a piece," she said. He grudgingly handed her a round of wood. She set it on the chopping block. "Hold the hatchet," she instructed. "Now, don't swing so hard. Just lift it and let its own weight do the work. Find the crack in the wood, the little line it wants to follow, and just guide the blade to it. Don't force it. Persuade it." Tom looked skeptical, but he did as she said. He lifted the hatchet, his arms less tense this time. He sighted along the grain of the wood, found a tiny fissure, and brought the blade down. Instead of a dull thud, there was a satisfying thwack, and the log split neatly in two. His eyes went wide with surprise and pride. He looked at Lena, a slow, genuine grin spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, as if she had just performed a magic trick. It worked. He set up another piece and split it just as easily. He spent the next half hour working with a focused, newfound skill, the pile of kindling growing steadily beside him. Lena sat back down on the steps, a small, quiet smile on her face. A fragile bridge of understanding had just been built between them. She didn't know that Cassian had returned early and was standing just inside the tree line, watching the entire exchange. He had been there for the last 10 minutes, silent and unseen. He watched Lena, her posture patient and calm, her voice a low, gentle murmur as she instructed the boy. He watched Tom, his initial defensiveness melting away into focused respect. He saw the easy, domestic harmony of the scene, the woman mending, the boy working, the afternoon sun slanting across the porch, the clean, sharp scent of split pine in the air. He saw the picture of a life he had never, in his wildest imaginings, thought he could have. His world had always been one of solitude, of survival, of moving on. It was a life defined by the jagged scar on his back, a permanent reminder of the violence and betrayal that had set him on his lonely path. That scar was his past. But what he was seeing now, this quiet scene of teaching and learning, of shared work and gentle peace, this felt like a future. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers tracing the puckered, familiar line of the scar through his shirt. For the first time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a boundary, a line he had crossed to get to this unexpected, sun-drenched place. "This is home," he whispered, the words so quiet they were stolen by the breeze. It was not a thought. It was a realization, a truth that settled deep in his bones with the weight of absolute certainty. Home was not a place. It was this. It was them. That evening, the cabin felt different. It felt fuller, warmer. After their meal, as Tom sat on the floor by the fire, meticulously carving a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a horse, Cassian rose from the table. He went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the same chest from which he had pulled the shirt for Lena weeks ago. He brought out a small, leather-bound book and a sharpened pencil. It was something he had bought in Red Rock Crossing, a purchase made on a hopeful impulse he hadn't fully understood at the time. He walked over to where Lena sat and placed the book in her hands. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his eyes communicating everything he could not say. It was a gift of profound trust. It was a blank slate. It was an invitation for her to write a new story. Lena looked down at the empty journal. Its clean, unmarked pages a stark contrast to the scarred and battered story of her life thus far. She felt a lump form in her throat. This man had given her shelter, given her a weapon, given her his trust. Now, he was giving her a voice. Later, when Tom was asleep on his cot and Cassian was sitting across the room, quietly cleaning the new Winchester, Lena opened the book in the warm, flickering light of the fire. She uncapped the pencil. Her hand, the same hand that had learned to wield a gun, was steady. On the first clean white page, she wrote 5 simple, declarative words. They were a vow, a testament, and a beginning. I am not running anymore. I choose to stay. The seasons began to turn. The fierce heat of summer softened, and the evenings grew longer, cooler, tinged with the crisp, clean scent of autumn. The canyon transformed, the deep greens of the cottonwoods and willows blushing with strokes of gold and rust. Life settled into a rhythm that was no longer defined by fear, but by the steady, comforting cadence of a shared existence. Tom was a constant, chattering presence, a bridge of youthful energy between 2 quiet adults. He followed Cassian on his trap lines, learning the secrets of the land with an eager intensity. He sat by the fire with Lena in the evenings, listening as she read to him from one of Cassian's worn books, her voice a low, steady melody that wove itself into the fabric of their home. She was no longer the strange woman, the intruder. She was Lena. She was a fixed point in his small universe, as solid and reliable as Cassian himself. Lena's journal became her private sanctuary. In its pages, she charted not just the events of the day, but the geography of her own healing. She wrote about the way the light hit the canyon walls at sunrise, the taste of the wild berry jam she'd learned to make, the quiet satisfaction of Tom finally mastering a new knot she'd taught him. She wrote about Cassian, describing the rare, fleeting smiles that touched his lips, the steady, reassuring weight of his presence, the way his silence could feel more comforting than any conversation. She was not just recording a life, she was building one, word by word. One afternoon, Cassian and Tom returned from a 2-day trip to a distant trading post for winter supplies. Lena was on the porch, plucking a wild turkey Cassian had shot the day before, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. She was humming a quiet, half-remembered tune, a simple act of contentment that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Cassian dismounted and unloaded the saddlebags, but instead of taking the supplies directly into the cabin, he paused. He pulled out a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It was a clumsy package, not a store-bought item. He held it for a moment, his expression unreadable, before placing it just inside the cabin door, on the small wooden bench where Lena kept her journal. He said nothing about it. He simply went about the business of unsaddling the horses, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as always. Later, after their supper of roasted turkey and cornbread, when Tom was asleep and the cabin was filled with a deep, peaceful quiet, Lena saw the package. Her curiosity piqued. She picked it up. It was surprisingly light. She untied the twine and carefully unfolded the paper. Inside, nestled in the brown paper, was a dress. It was not a new dress. The fabric, a soft, fine cotton, was faded to the color of a pale blue twilight sky, a shade that reminded her of the moments just after the sun has set. It was a simple garment, made with tiny, meticulous stitches. It had a modest, round collar and long sleeves, and it was clear from the slight wear at the elbows and hem that it had been worn, perhaps loved, by someone long ago. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, as if it had been kept carefully stored for years. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She knew, with an instinct that went deeper than words, that this was from Cassian. This was from the mysterious wooden chest at the foot of his bed, a place that held the few, precious remnants of his own unmentioned past. This was not a gift of ownership, like the ones she had been given before. This was an offering, a piece of his history, a piece of himself. She held the dress against her chest, the soft, clean fabric a stark contrast to the rough, mended shirt of his she always wore. She understood what it meant. It was an acknowledgement of her as a woman, not just a survivor. It was a silent question, a quiet invitation to step out of the shadows of the past and into a new, shared present. The next evening, as the last of the sun's fire bled from the sky, she prepared herself with the slow, deliberate care of someone enacting a sacred ritual. She heated water over the fire and washed, the warm water a soothing balm on her skin. She unbraided her long hair, brushing it until it shone in the firelight. Then, she put on the pale blue dress. It fit as if it had been made for her. The fabric was soft against her skin, the cut simple and graceful. As she looked at her faint reflection in the dark glass of the window pane, she saw not the haunted, ragged fugitive from Dry Hollow, but a woman she barely recognized. A woman who looked peaceful, whole. Cassian was on the porch, his chair tilted back against the cabin wall, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep indigo of the sky. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shick, a familiar, comforting sound. She opened the door and stepped out. The soft whisper of her dress was the only sound she made. He stopped his work, the whetstone falling silent in his hand. He looked up, and his breath caught. He saw her, bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the gloaming, wearing the dress that had belonged to his mother, a dress he had kept for reasons he had never fully understood until this very moment. He saw not a ghost from his past, but the living, breathing embodiment of his future. The look in his eyes was one of raw, unguarded reverence, a look of such profound tenderness that it made Lena's heart ache. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the smooth wooden planks of the porch. She stopped directly in front of him, so close that the hem of her dress brushed against his knees. The air between them was electric, thick with all the words they had never spoken, all the feelings they had only shown in actions. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, had imagined what she would say, but now, looking into his eyes, she knew that only the old words would do, the words that had marked their first true beginning. She reached out, her hands finding the familiar, rough fabric of his shirt collar. She fisted them gently, just as she had done all those weeks ago, and tugged, pulling his head down toward hers. He came willingly, his body leaning into her touch. The first time, her words had been a challenge, a plea born of fragile hope. This time, they were a vow. "Make me yours," she whispered, her voice husky with an emotion so deep it felt as bottomless as the night sky above them. This time, he did not tease, he did not smile. A look of solemn, profound certainty settled over his features. He simply held her gaze, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight, and he gave a single, slow nod. It was a promise. It was his consent. It was his own vow, spoken in his own silent language. And then he kissed her. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, a culmination of every shared silence, every unspoken fear, every quiet act of care that had passed between them. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke, of solitude and survival, of a loneliness so deep it had almost become a part of him. Now, finally, blessedly, ending. His lips were firm and gentle, and in their touch she felt the entirety of his history, the pain of his scar, the steadfastness of his soul. She kissed him back with all the pent-up gratitude and hope and love that had been growing inside her. It was a kiss of fierce, unshakable choice. She was not being taken. She was giving. She was not submitting. She was joining. Her hand slid from his collar to cradle the back of his head, her fingers tangling in his thick, dark hair. His arms came around her. One hand splayed against the small of her back, the other gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He drew her closer, until there was no space left between them, until her soft form was pressed against the hard, solid lines of his body. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, searching exploration, a language all its own that spoke of longing and belonging, of two broken halves finding their wholeness. He lifted her then with an easy, fluid strength that took her breath away and carried her back into the cabin. He kicked the door shut with his heel, closing them off from the rest of the world. In the warm, intimate glow of the firelight, he laid her gently on his own cot, the one that had been his solitary bed for years. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with an emotion so intense it felt like a physical force. There was no lust in his gaze, only a deep, reverent adoration. He saw not just the woman in the pale blue dress, but the survivor from the barn, the fighter with the colt, the teacher at the woodpile, the gentle soul who had brought life back into his empty world. There was no force. There was no hurry. There was only a slow, deliberate shedding of layers, both literal and metaphorical. He undid the small buttons on her dress with hands that were surprisingly gentle, his calloused fingers a stark, tender contrast to the soft fabric. It was an act of worship, an unveiling, for every scar she bore on her soul. He seemed to offer a silent prayer of healing with his touch. They came together not in a clash of bodies, but in a slow, inexorable melting of souls. It was a quiet, sacred act, performed in the flickering firelight of the home they had built and defended together. It was two solitudes, two deep pools of loneliness, flowing into one another to create a single, deep, and tranquil river. It was the raw, undeniable truth of what they had become to each other, expressed in the most honest language they possessed. It was a promise made flesh, a covenant sealed not with words, but with a silent, mutual surrender. Much later, they lay tangled together under a single wool blanket, the fire burning down to glowing embers. The pale blue dress lay pooled on the floor, a soft shadow in the dim light. Lena lay with her head on his chest, her ear against his ribs, listening to the slow, steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full, rich, and complete. "Tomorrow will be different," she whispered into the darkness, her voice soft with the aftermath of an emotion that had remade her. She felt the rumble in his chest as he spoke, his voice a low, certain vow that resonated through her entire body. "No," he said, "it will be forever." Cassian's promise of forever was not a loud declaration, but a quiet, foundational shift in the world, as subtle and profound as the turning of the earth. The morning after, Lena woke not to the stark solitude of her own palate, but to the solid warmth of his body beside her. The fire had burned down to a soft, pulsing glow, and in the pre-dawn stillness, she could hear the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. This, she thought, was the sound of peace. This was the sound of home. When Tom woke, he found them not in the same bed, but sitting at the small table, sharing a quiet cup of coffee. The air in the cabin was different. The taut wire of unspoken things that had always existed between the two adults was gone, replaced by a current of easy, humming intimacy. He saw it in the way Cassian's hand rested briefly on Lena's as he passed her the sugar, in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, a soft, private smile touching her lips. The boy, with the sharp, unsentimental wisdom of a child who has had to grow up too fast, took it all in. He didn't ask questions. He simply observed. A few days later, he was sitting on the floor, trying to relace a worn boot, his fingers fumbling with the stiff leather. Lena came and knelt beside him, not taking the boot from him, but guiding his fingers, her touch patient, her voice a low murmur. "You're like a ghost," Tom said suddenly, his eyes fixed on his task. Lena went still, her hand hovering over his. The word was a cold echo from a past she was trying to outrun. A ghost was what she had been, a silent, haunted presence, a thing of shadows and fear. But Tom wasn't finished. He looked up at her, his expression one of serious, childish consideration. Not a scary one, he clarified, as if it were a point of great importance. You're the house ghost. You're the one who makes sure the fire stays lit and the stew don't burn. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Lena's face, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. A house ghost, a guardian spirit, a keeper of the hearth. In his own simple, profound way, the boy had given her a new name, a new identity. He had seen past the fugitive and the survivor and had seen the woman who was putting down roots, the woman who was tending the soul of their small, unlikely family. The first snows came early that year, a soft, silent blanket of white that transformed the rugged canyon into a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. Winter was a hard time, a season of survival. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, and their reliance on each other became absolute. Cassian's knowledge of the land kept them fed, his traps providing a steady supply of rabbit and grouse. Lena's careful management of their supplies ensured nothing was wasted. Tom's youthful energy was a bright spark against the long, dark nights. They were no longer three separate individuals sharing a space. They were a unit, a tightly woven braid of dependencies and affections. They worked together, ate together, and in the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the howling of the wind outside a distant, irrelevant sound. Lena would read aloud, her voice rising and falling with the stories, while Tom listened, enraptured, and Cassian would sit in his chair, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of leather, his quiet presence a warm, protective weight in the room, in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. In the deep freeze of winter, they had created a pocket of impossible, radiant warmth. The spring thaw came with a rush, a great sighing release as the land shook off its blanket of snow. The creek, which had been frozen solid, swelled into a roaring, joyful torrent. The sun felt warm on the skin for the first time in months. The world, which had been rendered in monochrome shades of white and gray, exploded into a riot of color. One afternoon in late April, Cassian led them on a long walk, further up the canyon than Lena had ever been before. They rounded a high wall of red rock, and Lena stopped, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Before them lay a hidden meadow, a secret pocket of the world, carpeted in a breathtaking, impossible blanket of wildflowers. There were Indian paintbrushes, their tips a fiery scarlet, bluebonnets, the color of a deep summer sky, and 1,000 tiny yellow and white blossoms she did not know the names of. The air was thick with their sweet, delicate scent, and the meadow hummed with the lazy, contented buzz of bees. It was a place of pure, unadulterated beauty, a testament to the stubborn, resilient life that could flourish in even the harshest of landscapes. It felt, to Lena, like a reflection of her own soul. Tom, with a whoop of pure joy, plunged into the sea of flowers, his small form quickly disappearing amongst the vibrant colors. Cassian and Lena stood at the edge of the meadow, watching him, a shared, silent smile on their faces. The sun was warm on their shoulders, the gentle breeze cool on their cheeks. It was a moment of perfect, unblemished peace. Lena felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was a feeling of gratitude so immense it filled her chest to bursting. She looked at the man beside her, at his strong, quiet profile outlined against the blue sky. He was the architect of this peace, the guardian of this newfound world. He had taken in a broken, terrified creature and had given her not just shelter, but a home. Not just a weapon, but the strength to use it. Not just his body, but the entirety of his steadfast, honorable soul. She reached out and laid her hand on top of his. His was calloused and hard from a lifetime of work, hers smaller and softer, but their fingers intertwined as if they had been crafted for that very purpose. He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes asking a silent question. "The first day we met," she began, her voice a low, soft murmur. "In that dusty barn, all I wanted was to be invisible. I asked to hide under your coat, to disappear into your shadow." She paused, gathering the courage to say the truest thing she had ever known. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and shining. "Now," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I want to live under your heart." The confession hung in the warm, sunlit air between them, a declaration of a love that had been grown in silence, nurtured in shared hardship, and forged in the fire of a desperate fight. It was her final, complete surrender, not to a man, but to a life, to a future. Cassian's throat worked, but no words came. He was not a man of poetry or pretty speeches. His feelings were a deep, powerful river that ran too far below the surface for words to ever reach. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything she needed to know. She saw the reflection of her own love, her own devotion, her own certainty. He released her hand and reached up to his neck. For as long as she had known him, he had worn a simple leather thong tied there. It was a dark, worn piece of hide, softened with age and the oils of his own skin, tied with a simple, secure knot. It was a part of him, a piece of his mystery she had never questioned. With slow, deliberate movements, he untied it. He held the simple leather cord in his palm for a moment, as if saying a silent goodbye to it. Before he turned back to her, he took her left hand, the one that still bore the faint, silvery scar from the night of the attack, and gently, reverently, he wrapped the leather thong around her wrist. He tied it with the same simple, secure knot. A knot meant to hold, a knot meant to last. The worn leather was warm from his skin. It settled against her pulse, a steady, physical reminder of his presence, his promise. It was not a ring of gold or silver. It was something far more precious. It was a piece of him, a tangible piece of his past, his present, and his future, now tied inextricably to hers. They didn't need a wedding. They had no need for a preacher's words or a piece of paper from a town they didn't belong to. Their vows had been made in the quiet language of shared survival, in the heat of a desperate battle, in the sacred intimacy of a fire-lit cabin. Their union had been consecrated by the land itself, witnessed by the silent, watchful stones of the canyon. They stood together at the edge of the wildflower meadow, hand in hand, and watched as Tom, a bright spark of life in a sea of color, chased a butterfly toward the setting sun. They had everything they needed. They had the land. They had the boy. They had each other. They just needed tomorrow. Together. And they knew, with a certainty as deep and unshakable as the mountains around them, that they would have all the tomorrows they could ever want. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all share our thoughts and connect. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video. And if you can, support us further by hitting the hype button. It helps our stories reach more listeners just like you.